Hey everybody, welcome to today's lesson. My name is Brenton, and today I want to go over a strategy for improving and developing our Chaturanga, or our push-up position in yoga. I think developing our pushing ability is really important as sort of like a primary functional movement. If I think about, what do I always want to be able to do and train my body to keep and own all of that range, right? I always want to be able to move forward, backward in space, get up and down from the floor. I want to be able to pull things toward me. I want to be able to push things away from me. And those big movements are going to recruit a lot of activity from a lot of different parts of the body. So instead of thinking about it as like this muscle does this and this muscle does that, I kind of like to break it up. At least for me, it's a little bit more useful to think about it in terms of joint positions, because joint positions kind of imply that there's a job to do there. It's not flexion, it's extension. It's not rotation, it's abduction, whatever it is. And then the positioning, whatever we choose, is loaded in a particular way to provide a lot of challenge. And push-ups are very challenging because we have all of our body weight in them. We'll talk about some loading strategies as well in terms of how do I make it easier for me if it's too hard, which I think most of us are in that situation. And in yoga, I don't think that we often take the time to actually go into these details to look at like, what would actually be an effective strategy for me? Not just like wishful thinking or like, I'll do 1,000 chaturangas and then I'll be able to do chaturangas really well. I don't think it really works like that, especially as we start learning about the joint positions. We'll see that they're very nuanced and very specific, so it's better, probably most likely for most of us, to train them outside of a push-up practice or a chaturanga practice, and then to bring those skills into our push-up and sort of layer the complexity on. So let's dive into our push-up. Let's talk about it in terms of its joint positions. So these are joint positions that take the body out of anatomical neutral. Anatomical neutral would be more or less like if you were just dangling from the ceiling, how would your skeleton arrange itself, right? So in anatomical neutral, and you can imagine that as like, a person standing or something like that. The push-up goes through a chain of motion. So some of these joint positions change from the top to the bottom, some of them maintain throughout. We'll talk about sort of how they evolve through the chain of motion. But if I just sort of try to get like, okay, pelvis into anatomical neutral, ribs into anatomical neutral, spine into anatomical neutral, one of the, it starts in shoulder flexion, right? So the arms in front. And then as it moves through, the shoulders need to be able to move into extension, which is when the arms move back. When I'm talking about arms, I mean upper arms. So where's my upper arm? It's in front of my body, that's flexion. It's pulling back towards extension here. So that's one joint position, that's coordination, that's movement, right? But that happens in relationship with and in conjunction with other things that are going on. So one of the other things that goes on in my push-up is external rotation of the shoulder. And this can be a little bit more challenging to feel, I think, for one, because a lot of us spend our time sort of chronically internally rotated, that let alone just even being able to find what neutral might be for my shoulder, like where is neutral here in the socket, right? Like even beyond that, what's external rotation? And so you can just sort of play like, okay, arms down here in sort of like a simple to feel environment. You can start like rotating the arms forward and back. And then you can kind of see like, okay, in this externally rotated position, there's actually quite a bit of work that's happening back here. Lots of stability work, muscles under the armpits, around the rib cage, around the back up here. They need to be active and involved, especially if now I'm going to take my arm, my forearm, I'm going to try to keep this in external rotation as I lift my arm forward into that flexion, right? So that's where it starts. So that's already a lot to just even be able to discern in your own experience. And I think it just comes with like, hey, This is not instant gratification. Our gains are slow, and we're looking for better brain-body connections, which ultimately make us feel better and work better tomorrow. So we don't need to be perfect in order to feel better and work better tomorrow. We just need to do the work, okay? So external rotation, that's the thing about external rotation too, is that how much can I maintain that as the arms bend here? And you'll probably know if you've done a lot of push-ups, for most people, I don't want to say 100%, but very close to that, most people will have an issue with their shoulders wanting to internally rotate. Why? Because we spend a ton of time in internal rotation. And I think also when the shoulders are internally rotated, I think, and I don't have research to back me up on this, but I think what's also happening is your bones are sort of set in a way where they're enduring the movement, the intensity or the challenge of the movement, rather than your muscles actually producing contractile resistance against the huge load of your body weight. So the question is, can I have my shoulders externally rotated here? So once I can feel it here, I can sort of hold myself accountable, and it's okay, I don't want to feel this side of my arm bone rolling up like this towards the sky, right? But I can work one arm at a time and just bring the hand in and out. And I can see how equipped is my shoulder to do this motion unloaded. So none of my body weight here. How equipped is my shoulder to do that? And the more that you do that, you'll actually build up stability and strength here as one of the prerequisites for actually being able to do the pose. So that would be one thing I might recommend is, to train that with both arms. And, you can feel even right here, wow, and see where your hand wants to go. It's I don't care. I don't care if I have my hands a little bit wider than I might normally set them, if that's how this feels okay for my shoulder. So my shoulder doesn't want to move and roll in right into that internal rotation. And you might find today that you only got this much before the shoulder wants to cave in. That's okay. We're just going to keep working and building on the range over time. So hopefully this is all adding up, making sense to you so far. The other thing that happens in the shoulder, which is something really worthwhile to talk about, is shoulder blade retraction, where the shoulder blades go toward each other. And that happens about halfway down the shape here. So if I just take a knees down version, let's say, kind of set my arms in that external rotation, I'm gonna see if I can feel that. But about halfway down here after the elbows bend, about here, now my shoulder blades need to be able to come together. And now my shoulder blades need to be able to come together without my ribs and spine doing that same movement. And if my ribs and spine did that same movement, this is what it would look like. It would look like as my shoulder blades come together, this would happen, right? And so you might be one of those people who has a floppy push-up and your belly comes down first, not because you're weak in your core necessarily, but maybe you don't have enough mobility up here in the back of your shoulders to let the shoulder blades come together, but let everything else lower down in one line, one plank. So because the length of the arm is kind of set, right? So as we come down, and this is a good way to work your shoulder blade mobility. I actually have a full class on that, so you can just go do your shoulder blade mobility. But again, trying to just do 1,000 push-ups and hope that you get more shoulder blade mobility is probably not the most time-effective strategy. It's not the most optimal strategy in terms of loading your body. I would recommend taking these pieces, these joint positions, and looking at okay, how can I train those not in a push-up? How can I get my brain to have a more nuanced, sophisticated mapping of that area of my body so that when I go to the push-up, it's less confusing. And I possibly see those gains kind of adding together to create something else. So other things that are going on, we obviously have elbow movement in there, right? So I need to be able to hinge my elbow. I need to be able to pronate my forearm. That means turn my palm face down. Why do I need to be able to do that? Well, because if my shoulder is set externally, this is in the abducted position, but it's still external. And if everything goes external through the hand, look at what happened. My palm goes up. But you obviously can't do a push-up with your palm up, right? Your palm needs to be down on the ground. So how do I get it? Well, I freeze my upper arm in external rotation. Then I rotate through the forearm to pronate. So now it's sort of like a double helix in the arm. And now I extend my wrist 90 degrees. So that's the last one, is 90 degrees of wrist extension. So if I can't do that up here, why would I think that I would be able to do that in a plank and with all of my body weight behind it, right? So it's like, okay, I kind of get this like double helix, like this is externally rotating. You could think of pronation of your forearm also as like my shoulders externally rotating, my forearms internally rotating, kind of like opposites. But the point is there, it's like, how can I kind of freeze the rotational elements of this so that my forearm doesn't want to be doing this throughout the chain of movement? Can you see this? Right? So that it just is bending, but it's not rotating. And same thing with my shoulder, it's extending, but it's not changing its rotation. Does this make sense a little bit? So now we can talk about, like, those are the changes away from anatomical neutral that then create your push-up. So now the question is, okay, I have a little bit of a sense of that. Now what do I do? Well, I need a loading strategy. I need a strategy for moving from point A to point B to C, all the way to Z. So the way that we do this is first we test, do I have these joint positions, right? And you can go back with me through this video, test out these joint positions. All of my mobility classes for these different joints are going to go through this and take you through this as well. So you kind of figure out, you have to be your own kind of assessor and say, I'm going to take responsibility for this. I'm going to learn, like, where am I really weak? Like, maybe I don't have enough pronation of my forearm, right? Maybe the external rotation of the shoulder, maybe it's the shoulder blade mobility. Any number of these things could impact our push-up and make it feel not so great and like we're not getting those gains that we want to see. So you need to get those component pieces, and then we need to start loading them. Load means challenge. It means add some type of challenge. And there's lots of different ways we can do this, including on our yoga mat. Just like if we're in class, we have our strategy for when we're in class, and we're our strategy when we have, you know, like our countertop at home, or like we're out on our hike and we see a bench, or like whatever it is, right? So train your joint positions. Load those joint positions. Like if you're loading external rotation and doing some of your arm work, maybe you start wearing 2.5 pound wrist weights that you Velcro on over and you train that. And so that introduces your arms to that load in a different format, so that, you know, you have a lot of body weight. So you got to get strong for this, right? You could train this even like if you did bench presses, for example. That's essentially the same exact pose but flipped over on your back, and that's one way to control your weight, right? You can say, well, I weigh 150 pounds, but obviously I'm not doing that today. I'm doing 15, right? It'd be really hard for you to like get down to 15 pounds like in the actual shape. So here's our strategies for our load, right? We practice our joint positions. We start loading them with, you know, you hold a weight, you strap a weight around, you strap a resistance band around. You find something that externally that you can apply that will challenge you and make your muscles adapt, right? Now the other thing is then we want to start actually training that position, right? We actually want to get into the plank and lower down and repeat this. And so our strategies for doing that is to change the angle of the pose. So where the angle of the pose on the ground is in, you know, all of the body weight here. Let's imagine that I kept this same shape, right? But I reoriented it against a wall. And so now I'm kind of like on tiptoes, right? A little bit. And I'm leaning against a wall and I try to feel plank there. And then I try to involve some of my push-ups there. And when I'm involving those push-ups there, you know, at the wall, all of the weight is in my feet at the wall, right? So it's gonna feel very different. It might feel super light even. It might even feel kind of quote unquote easy. And so the way that you would take something easy, make it more challenging at the wall, would be to give yourself more time under tension. In this case, repetitions. So when you're doing your push-ups against the wall, it's maybe 30 repetitions, right? And you might say to yourself, like, okay, like you develop the training plan. It depends on, like, you know, how gung-ho you want to be about this, right? But once you have your prereqs of your joint positions, you put it all together, you go to a wall, then you gradually start graduating and lowering the angle and the shape back down to the floor. So that might look like, for me, oftentimes in the kitchen. If I'm doing something in the kitchen, I'll take a few reps of push-up over a countertop, over a railing at the beach, right? Like if I find a bench and I'm out on a hike, I'll use the bench for several different things, and one of those things might be some push-ups. Gradually, you take that position all the way back down, and you'll feel like you have a lot more capacity there. Now, the last loading strategy I might recommend would be like, okay, what are we doing when we're actually in the yoga room? And the yoga room, obviously we can't get up and like go over to the wall, or, you know, we don't have external weights, for example, that we can like practice joint positions or something like that. And also it's like, usually that pose happens in a flow, right? Where like, you don't have that much time. So I find in that position, lowering down to the knees is a really great option, although it does change the position entirely. So it's sort of like, I think about that as like my kind of quick fix, but it doesn't excuse me from learning how to do the push-up with the knees up. So if you find that that's all you're ever doing, consider adding in some of the wall push-ups, some of the countertop push-ups, some of your loaded joint positions, right? But then, yeah, in class, you would do a knees down, and knees down where, like, you know, shoulders are over the wrists, right? But one thing I see a lot is like booties back, and then people are bending at their elbows here and like looking around really confused because it doesn't make sense. And you're right, it doesn't make sense to do it like that. So you need your butt kind of suspended between your shoulders and your knees. And then you want to be able to feel here, like, can I feel my shoulders externally rotating? My forearms pronating. And just trying to work as, you know, I would recommend doing reps in class too. Something to keep in mind is that we're stronger on our way down to the floor than we are pushing back up from the floor. So what you might do is like an intermediate stage is say, okay, I'm gonna come all the way down, you know, I'm gonna do my best to come down, and then I'll let myself get back up any way I want, you know? And in some cases this is moot because traditionally Chaturanga is just that first top of the push-up anyway. But if we're gonna train our bodies how to push, we should probably be able to push in both directions, right? So just know that these are your different loading strategies. And so now you can take this information, hopefully, and you can kind of parse through like what might your homework be. You know, if you're looking for homework like right after this class, I say go and do all of my, you know, my mobility sequences for, you know, shoulder rotation, for shoulder flexion and extension, for your forearms, for your wrists, for your hands. So you can start to get a sense of like, okay, how might I explore external rotation of my shoulder? And, you know, if this is kind of the first time you're exploring joint positions, yeah, it seems like a big apple to bite into, but you know, it's a much smaller apple than trying to understand like all the individual names of your muscles and like what they supposedly do and don't do, right? Like it's a much more like, I feel like accessible way of understanding movement in our bodies. And I feel like, you know, this applies not just to push-ups, it applies to every movement that we do. So if we have a good understanding of joint positionings, what's possible in our joints, and like what different shapes are asking from our body, we're able to sort of construct a strategy and a plan that makes sense, that actually gets us to our end goal, which has been my biggest frustrating pain point of my time until I sort of started thinking more along these lines, was just that I had these lofty goals of I want to be able to do this and I want to be able to do that, but it didn't seem like anything I was doing was actually getting me closer. So if nothing else, I hope that what I shared today here helps you in some way. That's the point. Let me know if you have questions or anything in the comments below. And of course, if you're inspired to donate to this work, I'd love to see you over on our Patreon. So I will include a link to that in the description below. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you here soon.